you had a great article in Harper's that came out earlier this year titled History as End, 1619, 1776, and the Politics of the Past. I think what's important about this article is that you sort of look at and critique what you see as, I guess, a tendency that's sort of emerging among liberals, where, people will invoke, I guess, like past atrocities or injustices in order to ostensibly shed some light on politics today. But, in the piece, you argue that in many ways, this kind of thinking, sort of distorts or artificially limits how we should actually practice politics. So I want to start by just quickly reading a short quote from that article, and then I have a question for you. So you write, "The role of history today, especially within liberal discourse, has changed. Rather than mine the past for usable politics, whether as analog, inspiration, or warning, thinkers now travel in the opposite direction, from present injustice to historical crime. Current American inequalities, many liberals insist, must be addressed through encounters with the past. Programs of reform or redistribution, no matter how ambitious, can hope to succeed only after the country undergoes a profound reckoning, to use the key word of the day, with centuries of racial oppression." So I think we can, over the course of this conversation, unpack that a little bit. But I first wanted to kick off by asking you, why is it that liberals are drawn to this sort of engagement with history right now?
Yeah, I mean, the piece goes into this at some more length, but I think there's a broader shift that's happened. Kind of, you could describe it as a sort of a civil war within liberalism, because in a lot of these arguments, about the 1619 Project, you'll have people like Sean Wilentz, who is one of the most outspoken critics, some would say pugnacious critics of the project, who insist that he's the true liberal in this fight and the 1619 represents something else. But to me, when I argue with Sean about this stuff, I'm like, no, they're liberals. It's the New York Times. What could be more liberal than the New York Times Magazine? It's whether you have a kind of a functional or a sort of an almost an abstract idealistic definition of liberalism, I guess, maybe. But I think what's happened is, for large sections of the liberal left, the media class and elsewhere, to be sort of sympathetic for a minute, even though I do have these critiques of 1619, et cetera, is that the kind of, if you will, the sort of bland optimism of the sort of Democratic Party's vision of the past, from Bill Clinton through to Obama. Obama's favorite line that he always quoted from King, who was borrowed it from Theodore Parker, an abolitionist, about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This sense that, for all, whatever reverses we have faced in history past, slavery, dispossession of Native Americans, abuse of, violence against, working class and labor, organizers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, oppression of women. All of these things are like in the process of being corrected, or if they have not already been corrected. And that was the sort of, in Obama, in some ways was the apotheosis of this kind of embodiment of a belief in not just the capacity to transcend the past, but this idea almost that, the past had been transcended in his own person in some sense. And I think in the decade, basically since his election, we saw huge amounts of disillusionment. And I think some of that is sort of genuine. And I don't want to make it all about Obama, but I think a broader disillusionment post-economic crisis, post Ferguson and other sort of their other flashpoints, with the persistence of just the absolutely most savage, grueling inequalities in American life. You can track them along racial lines, you can track them along class lines, you can track them in all sorts of ways. But it's clear that for all of the sort of happy talk about moral arcs and progress, this is still, one of the most unequal societies in the history of the world, maybe the most. And so I think, again, we can get to my sort of problems with the 1619 Project's approach, but I think the genesis for it comes out of quite an authentic frustration with this idea of that history, that American history in particular only has to sort of, that every problem is just it's just a temporary impediment to the obvious working out of a solution. When you think about you think about the economic history of this country since, say, the 1960s or the civil rights movement, and you realize that the material conditions that, many of the figures in the 1960s, like Martin Luther King, like, you guys have talked a lot about, Paul, I know, is obsessed with Bayard Rustin, et cetera. With
Philip Randolph.
Philip Randolph. Both of them, no? I don't know.
Yeah, both. But
a little of A and B.
We saw you struggling.
Oh, come on. Anyway, well, I've had meetings with him about Bayard Rustin, not Philip Randolph. So anyway, that being leave that where it's made. A lot of these foundational figures in this movement for racial justice, talked about this economic and the sort of undergirding economic injustice in the 1960s. And you look at the country today, it's more unequal. So I think by any number of measures. So I think, in other words, there's plenty of cause for a desire for a sweeping revision of the sort of liberal pieties that have kind of governed our history and our kind of bland belief in progress. That's not going to cut it anymore. The question is, what kind of revision do we need?
Right. It's funny. I mean, so much of what has kind of made up liberal attitudes to politics has largely been, we're the people who are on the side of truth and of facts and of science and of reason, that there's like kind of like they claim to be like holding on to like those things that typically we would associate with like the Enlightenment or the left traditionally. But also like this is, I think Obama's kind of a perfect example, because the Obama years were, like neoliberals are saying, we're not ideological. We're just doing what's most rational. Like we're doing what has to happen in order to keep the country going. There's, Thomas Frank has kind of characterized this as like the project was already complete by the 90s. So it's mostly just kind of, keeping the ship going forward, keeping the deck swabbed. But obviously, I think that has just been so thoroughly punctured that people obviously don't believe that anymore. It seems like you spend a good chunk of your piece delineating kind of how conservatives approach history and then how liberals approach history. And it does seem like there's something of a convergence where it is just history for political expediency's sake. And it becomes kind of a self rationale for, why they have these really, milquetoast politics that are really just to the benefit of middle class people.
Yeah, the frustration for me on the sort of left liberal side of it is that even if to some extent, I think there are different, we could probably get deeper into and sort of delineate various like kind of sub tendencies within, say, the New York Times view of American history. I think, Nicole Hannah-Jones certainly has one perspective, but even within the contributors of the project, or more broadly between the sort of leadership of the New York Times and other sort of liberal or left liberal figures that have glommed, and sort of celebrated the project. I think some of it is really derived from this, like I said, a sort of an authentic frustration with the current conditions and a belief that like, okay, what we really need to do is expose the deep rot and this country's origins in this particular kind of oppression that essentially have sort of determined its entire history to this point. And once we expose that, once we reckon with that, there will be, I think this part is usually unstated, but there will be some sort of catharsis wherein like somehow contemporary issues will be addressed. And then of course there are other people who are within that frame who have a very different kind of political vision, who don't really think that any kind of catharsis or transformation is possible, but are equally as sort of attracted to, in some ways, the sort of the pessimism of this vision or the sense of limits.
Mm-hmm.
This is where that kind of technocratic idea that, Kayla, you're talking about comes in, and I think is actually sort of oddly compatible with this, that, okay, there is this sort of like there are these like dark currents that run through American history, that, various, what we might have thought, what an older narrative used to teach us were moments of kind of progressive change, like emancipation or the civil rights, actually only covered over these deeper continuities of oppression. And in some ways that shows the limits of what we can actually do in the present. So what we really need to focus on is almost kind of basically keeping the barbarians, holding the barbarians off at the gate, keeping the far right out of power, and kind of just shoring up the meager resources that we have in a country that is in some sense almost doomed by its history, and really can't ask for more. And I think that's also often unstated because very few people would want to confront that, much less speak out loud that kind of politics, because it's like so dispiriting. But I think that both of those kind of unstated assumptions together fuel this particular kind of this particular kind of revision, which is so kind of relentlessly pessimistic to the point of being paralytic about struggle in American history.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.